Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Just Infrastructure Speaker Series. And for those returning, welcome back. My name is Carrie Karahalios, and along with Anita Chan and Indy Gupta, my fellow co-leads of the Just Infrastructures Initiative, we will be your hosts for today's event. We will be live tweeting today's event using the hashtag JustInfrastructures with a capital J and capital I.
For those of you who don't know us yet, Just Infrastructures is an initiative created by researchers to interrogate the complex interactions between people, algorithms, and AI-driven systems. You can learn more about us and see more about our last talk this spring with Sasha Costanza-Chalk on May 5th at our website at just-infras.illinois.edu. A link has been added to the chat, and we'll resume our series in the fall.
We would like to thank our funders and sponsors, the Computer Science Department, the School of Information Sciences, the Granger College of Engineering's SRI program, Capital One, and the Community Data Clinic for supporting this programming. We also have a long list of non-financial co-sponsors you can see on our website, and we would like to thank them as well.
To ask a question, please use the Q&A box. We'll go through the questions at the end of the talk. Closed captioning and American Sign Language support is also available. Please use the chat to request any tech support, and a note that this talk is being recorded. And I'd now like to ask you to join me in a land acknowledgement. As a land-grant institution, the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign has a responsibility to acknowledge the historical context in which it exists and the exclusions and erasures of the indigenous peoples on whose lands it is located.
We are currently on the lands of the Peoria, Kaskaskia, Piankashaw, Vea, Miami, Mascoutin, Ottawa, Sauk, Meskwaki, Kickapoo, Potawatomi, Ojibwe, and Chickasaw nations. This acknowledgement demonstrates a commitment to beginning the process of working to dismantle the ongoing legacies of settler colonialism. Acknowledgements invite us to ask, what does it mean to live in a post- and neo-colonial world? What did it take for us to get here? And how can we be accountable to our part in history?
We'd now like to turn it over to our esteemed presenter. We are extremely honored to have Dr. Lilly Irani here with us today. Lilly Irani is an associate professor of communication and science studies at University of California, San Diego. She also serves as faculty at the Design Lab, Institute for Practical Ethics, the Program in Critical Gender Studies, and sits on the Academic Advisory Board of AI Now. She is author of Chasing Innovation, Making Entrepreneurial Citizens in Modern India. Chasing Innovation has been awarded the 2020 International Communication Association Outstanding Book Award and the 2019 Diana Forsythe Prize for feminist anthropological research on work, science, or technology, including biomedicine. Her research examines the cultural politics of high-tech work and the counter practices they generate as both an ethnographer, a designer, and a former technology worker. She's a co-founder of the digital worker advocacy organization Turkopticon. Her work has appeared at ACM SIGCHI, New Media and Society, Science, Technology and Human Values, South Atlantic Quarterly, and other venues. She sits on the editorial committee of Public Culture and on the editorial advisory boards of New Technology, Work and Employment, and Design and Culture. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Lilly Irani. Lilly, the floor is yours.
All right, well, thank you so much for putting this incredible series on just infrastructures together and gathering people to pay attention to this question, because I think the question of infrastructure, as I'm going to argue in my, I'm going to kind of reaffirm in my talk, I think is a really good and important way of framing a lot of how technology is shaping our lives. Today, the topic of my talk is claiming democracy for digital infrastructures. And this topic is bigger than any one talk or one person can ever address. But I just wanted to keep this frame as something that might guide many of us who are doing design work, engaging, as part of our communities to shape technology for the better. I also want to acknowledge that I stand and give this talk on unceded Kumeyaay territory here in the San Diego-Tijuana border region, and the US-Mexico border actually bisects and divides that nation. and keeps many people from moving as they have for centuries. So the border is also an infrastructure, and there's a lot of layers that we have to work on. The backdrop for this talk, in which I'm encouraging us to support the work of claiming democracy, is also the growth of ethics and the kind of incursion of computational tech into our public institutions, from policing to education to healthcare. And so as you hear this talk, I hope that you're thinking about the ways we think about tech ethics or big data ethics as we go along. So my central argument today is that design research of like this sort of HCI research that I've been trained to do and have been doing for decades, or tool building alone, are ill-equipped to transform infrastructures. And to transform infrastructures, we need to address political agency to redirect the technologies that impact our lives and the lives of those communities that we belong to. So by political agency, I mean the capacity of agents to create effect through direct and institutional action. So the question is, we can imagine a better world, we can design a better world, but how are we going to actually dismantle the things that are in the way of that and push the institutions, or even occupy the institutions that have the, that are able to create the durable change that we'd like to see? To give you an overview of how I'm going to approach this, I'm going to start off by talking about political agency and the limits of design. And then I'm going to move on to two case studies. The first is a struggle for democratic oversight over city surveillance technology acquisition in San Diego. In this case, we've got a highly organized set of community organizations that already have experience doing racial justice work. And this case study lets me zoom in on what people coming from more HCI and computing fields were able to contribute to the work of that coalition in shaping the infrastructures that our city was investing in. The second case study is of Turkopticon, a decade-old software project that provides a kind of Yelp for employers of Amazon Mechanical Turk workers, or online data processing gig workers. In talking about this case, I want to show the limits of software in creating the kind of political agency that would actually enable workers to improve their work conditions in meaningful ways, and talk about the transition from Turkopticon as a software project to Turkopticon as a worker-led advocacy organization. And then I'm going to wrap up by reflecting on how claiming political agency requires us to learn new ways of organizing and relating to one another, ways that are discouraged by post-Fordist forms of production of the sort that I wrote about in my book, Chasing Innovation. So why am I talking about political agency over digital infrastructures? Well, digital infrastructures are the kinds of things as an ex-tech worker I was contributing to building through my acts of coding. Those of us who do research in computer science and AI create knowledge, train workers, develop techniques that ultimately influence the formation of these technologies. And these technologies, I call them infrastructures because following Paul Edwards, I want us to understand them as, quote, those systems without which contemporary societies cannot function. Infrastructures, as talked about by Lee Starr, Jeff Bowker, so many others, they cut across space and they cut across communities. They're invisible to most, and much of what they, much of what they do actually can affect communities very differently. In cases of policing technologies, for example, some might be harmed by data collection techniques because they're in communities that are hyper-policed, while others might not directly experience the impact of a data record that they did not know the police had. Some of the challenges of gaining agency over political, some of the challenges of gaining political agency over infrastructure are, one, infrastructure is often politics by other means, as Chandra Mukherjee has argued. So Chandra Mukherjee studied the canals that were built in France and talked about how the canals connected Paris to the provinces of France in ways that seemed merely like acts of logistics, the act of moving water around and making it possible for boats to move around. But this actually changed the political structure of France also by making far off places closer to the center of state power. And so sometimes people think that technology is going to bring progress, it's going to bring opportunity, and they don't necessarily think about how it actually affects the operation of political institutions. In the United States specifically, but I don't think only in the United States, we also see infrastructures that are often, maybe run for a public agency, but they're actually owned by a private company. And as owned by a private company, their algorithms or the ways that they're designed are guarded as trade secrets into which public institutions or citizens who might want to have transparency into that system, they just experience a black box or opacity there. And I know, and these private companies, especially the very large ones like Amazon, Google, Facebook, and Apple, we've been engaged in a public conversation asking, how much influence do these companies have over the ways the federal government or local governments actually regulate these technologies? Political scientists have a concept called state capture when they look at how private actors are able to organize public conversations, organize who rotates into positions of public authority, or organize what kinds of policies can get passed in ways that favor the interests of those private actors who effectively captured the state. And this can make it really difficult for citizens to use the normal instruments of our democracy to shape these infrastructures or the regulatory regimes that are supposed to constrain them. Another challenge with digital infrastructures and gaining political agency is that those with the training to dissect and trace the infrastructure and how it works are often not the ones most directly harmed. So a number of people here at UIUC have done incredible work trying to make the operations of algorithms visible to everyday people, and looking at what kinds of reflection that encourages. But in the United States, where education is expensive, students go into debt to get it, and it takes many years to acquire a computer science education. I think computer science education is an incredible kind of investment of social wealth in some people who maybe are often more privileged, and they are the ones who have, effectively the plumbers of these digital pipes and know how they work. But on the other side, you have people who, are underemployed or unemployed or subject to policing, prison industrial complex, and they're the ones that might be most directly harmed by these infrastructures. And so that's a challenge for having those most directly impacted gaining agency over them. And then finally, there's a challenge that infrastructures are invisible to many people. And so how do you organize around something that people can't see? With all these challenges, we're also at an amazing time when there's many authors who've been trying to lay the groundwork for what community-led transformation of technologies can look like. Works like Digital Dead End, Design Justice, and Race After Technology all make different suggestions about ways that communities can lead practices of technologists to build the worlds that we need. Digital Dead End is especially strong around looking at how project-oriented community building can strengthen communities that are, that don't have enough resources and shaping technology policy. Race After Technology talks about how technology and design efforts can be put towards abolitionist efforts rather than efforts that reinscribe racial hierarchies under racial capitalism. And I've learned a tremendous amount also from Yeshi Milner's work in Abolish Big Data and Data for Black Lives. I remember I saw her talk at UC Irvine that Roderick Crooks organized in 2019, and she just had example after example of people showing up at their school district meetings, showing up at their city council meetings to resist certain educational technologies, or resist ankle bracelets for being used to create what Ruha Benjamin calls open air prisons. And so I also want to acknowledge that the work that I'm going to be talking about and trying to create a wider conversation around it, I'm trying to amplify work that's been happening for a long time. So I've learned a tremendous amount from these works, but I want to pick up with the question of not just how can design serve social movements, as many of these works focus on, but also how do we account for and build the political agency of movements that we hope to contribute to? What resources can we offer to strengthen communities' voices and hands in these political processes? And how does that demand things of us that's more than just design or engineering in the ways that computer scientists are asked to participate in society. So the first case is about how a coalition of community groups, including racial justice organizers and tech worker organizers, came together to subject surveillance infrastructures to democratic oversight. This case illustrates a variety of ways that we put in HCI, human-computer interaction, and information studies knowledge practices into service of a coalition of already really organized community groups to gain democratic control over surveillance technologies. And this coalition work is really important wherever you fall on the spectrum of what should happen with surveillance technologies, because you can't, a lot of surveillance technologies get adopted in relative secret in our experience in San Diego, and you can't modify and you can't refuse what you can't see. So the battle over smart streetlights in San Diego, where I live, was the battle between what, to some extent at first, what the city said the streetlights were for and what it really was. So the streetlights were championed by the mayor's office, and the people who are championing it went to city council and said, hey, we've got these great smart streetlights we want to install. We just need you to approve the budget. And what these streetlights do is they save energy by turning the lights on and off at the right times based on what the sun is doing. What the champions of the streetlights did not tell city council, and city council did not discuss publicly, at least in the recordings that I watched, was that the streetlights also had cameras, microphones, and hard drives on them that were connected to the cloud. They had object detection algorithms, so both for counting pedestrians, buses, cars, bicyclists, for city planning purposes, but also you could install apps to extend the functionality of the streetlights. And there were extensive apps for things like live stream surveillance. And the city installed over 3,000 of them without any discussion of the surveillance capacities of these lights, simply to save energy, according to council. But just as soon as they launched the streetlights, since council approved the loan, the champions in the mayoral office actually did start advertising that the streetlights had these other capabilities. The mayor gave a talk launching the streetlights, and he cited the city's hacktivists and civic tech enthusiasts as being people who should come hack on the lights, build apps that are useful, and improve the community. In my interviews with city officials, it seems that the streetlights were imagined as an economic development strategy to gentrify San Diego into a city that's more appealing for technology workers and entrepreneurs. And in some ways, like, those entrepreneurs could have a kind of first mover advantage by being the first one to tinker and build stuff on this new system. Just to be reflexive about my social position within San Diego, I actually found out about these streetlights through the design lab, because the design lab at San Diego was in the circuit of kind of city power that was trying to cultivate these cool apps to give San Diego kind of a reputation and a burgeoning smart city economy. So, so the lights were installed, just to get the timeline straight, like the lights were installed in 2016. And, in early 2019, there was actually a reporter, Jesse Marks, and several others who had reported on the surveillance aspects of the technology. But by that early 2019, community groups hadn't really picked up on it. And I was kind of left just ranting to fellow graduate student workers at my university and anyone who would listen about like how worried I was about these streetlights. But I didn't know what to do, because I did not know the things that I'm trying to share with you today. So that's why I'm sharing them with, that's what I'm sharing, why I'm sharing what I'm about to share. When community groups did pick up on it was when the city wanted to expand the program. And for some reason, somebody who was working within the city quietly said, hey, if you want to expand this program, you should probably have some public forums to let the community know about it and get input. And so the city organized these meetings called Technology for Good. San Diego is a smart city, a little bit of a leading framing in my personal opinion. And they held meetings in libraries around the city. And so Khalid Alexander is an organizer from a part of San Diego that's primarily Black and brown, and experiences intense amounts of police surveillance and criminalization of people who live there. And he saw these meetings, he went to one of them, he thought these lights seemed kind of weird. he worried that it would intensify existing police surveillance practices. And so he started getting in touch with a bunch of other community organizers he knew that were part of different organizations. And so he got in touch with someone in Tech Worker Coalition San Diego, and that person let the rest of us who were involved in that group know. And we sent about 5 people to that meeting at the library to help the coalition just ask hard questions using the various kinds of knowledge that we know how. Now that meeting, that community forum ended up being the kind of spark moment that led to the formation of the coalition, because that was when a bunch of different people from different community groups were in the room asking about racialized policing practices, asking about what the hardware really acts like, asking about who owns the data. And it was also very clear at that meeting that the police were highly invested in the technology, even though that hadn't really been publicly discussed before, because most of the meeting was actually a police captain answering questions. And it turns out, about a year later, it turns out that smart streetlights became exclusively a tool for the police. Now, before journalists established that it was exclusively a tool for police, the community organizing was well underway. The formation of the Trust Coalition was well underway. And that's because the community groups that came together in the coalition, they had situated knowledge about their own experiences with institutions that they used to make inferences about the probable futures of this digital technology infrastructure. So Pillars of the Community, the organization Khalid founded, they had been working on gang documentation surveillance for years. And so for those who don't know, what gang documentation is the process by which police get permission from a judge to set up a set of criteria for for basically labeling people as being gang members. And so police will go station themselves in communities and observe who's talking to who, and so like they'll have criteria like person, if the person meets 3 criteria, like lives in this neighborhood, is wearing a blue shirt, and is talking to somebody who is already documented as a gang member, then that person can be added to the gang database. And once somebody's added to this gang database, this kind of recursive criminalization algorithm, just based on kind of police like in-person surveillance, then if they are brought in and charged with a crime, they can get what's called a gang enhancement, which can add years to a prison sentence. There's even a case in San Diego where somebody who was at a party but was not involved in a fight in which somebody ended up dying, that person had been associated with a gang by the police, and so that person was actually charged with the murder, that he didn't have a weapon, like he wasn't there, he wasn't involved in the fight. So so community groups that had already had this experience of surveillance practices, they saw the streetlights as potentially intensifying or extending the existing institutional practices. And to me, that's actually a pretty smart move because infrastructures don't just create new practices, infrastructures layer on to kinds of social relationships that are already there, and perhaps create new ways, easier ways, extended ways for those practices to develop, which can eventually evolve into something new, but they layer on what we already do. Another community that had past experience of surveillance practices was the Muslim community in San Diego, which especially post 9/11 had seen their places of worship highly surveilled by FBI investigators who place plainclothes people in the mosque, would sometimes try, these people who would come into the mosque from law enforcement would sometimes try to radicalize people in the mosque and then entrap them and accuse them of being terrorists. And so groups like Partnership for the Advancement of New Americans or Council for American Islamic Relations saw these streetlights and started looking to see, like, are these installed by our mosques? Like why wouldn't the FBI use this to surveil who's coming in and out of the mosque? And how is that going to chill people's desire to worship? Like, how is that going to end up criminalizing people with surveillance data that's taken from way out of context? So the communities that were in San Diego in some ways had a better read of the problems of the surveillance technology than I did. Like, I was worried about privacy, I was worried about the monetization of data on San Diegans, and I was worried about tech gentrification just because of the kinds of research that I had done and having lived in San Francisco. But it was by coming together as a coalition that people with very different social experiences could come together and bring these different situated knowledges and speculations together to try to imagine, like, what could this infrastructure mean and what do we want to do about it? So the Trust Coalition did bring together 30 plus community organizations, and you can search for Trust Coalition San Diego if you want to read more. I also think it's important to note that the Trust Coalition really builds on racial justice coalition efforts that have been happening in San Diego for almost a decade, of people trying to achieve police oversight commissions and to end carotid chokeholds. And so there's already a group of people who had working relationships with one another and knew how to organize. Pretty quickly, the coalition in meetings decided that the goal was not just to shut down the streetlights. The coalition asked for a moratorium until a proper investigation of how the streetlights are used and the policies that govern them could be determined. But the real goal was to subject surveillance technologies in general to democratic oversight, because the streetlights had just become one public example of the ways that cities are actually acquiring surveillance technologies that affect communities all the time. It had revealed the problem of city council electeds who are putatively accountable to voters, don't actually often have the expertise to ask difficult questions about these streetlights, and they often don't come from positions, and even if they come from neighborhoods where they might be more attuned to some of the social justice questions that I talked to you about, they might not make the connection between that and this technology that's supposed to be for something else, like sustainability. And so we worked on getting an ordinance passed as modeled primarily off of Oakland, California's ordinance that said any surveillance technology that the city wants to acquire, and the ordinance defines surveillance technology, it needs to be, it needs to come to city council, and it needs to come to a privacy advisory board with a description of what the technology is supposed to be used for, a use policy, and a kind of working through what the potential civil liberties and equity impacts of that technology are going to be in the form of an impact report. The Privacy Advisory Board was there to support the work of City Council in investigating these technologies. But the hope was that the Privacy Advisory Board that we ended up calling for included both people who are kind of experts in the infrastructure, people with some auditing experience or cybersecurity experience, or people who understand civil liberties law, but also about half the board had seats reserved for representatives of community organizations that represent communities that have historically been surveilled, so that people with direct experience of surveillance by companies or the state would be at the table. And the Privacy Advisory Board would kind of write up an assessment and a recommendation of this technology acquisition the city was proposing, and then provide that to the council. And then the ordinance would also require, so the ordinance would kind of make these technology acquisitions visible. It would slow down the process of acquisition so that community organizers could get people involved in the process, could get them to the council meeting or to the Privacy Advisory Board meeting. And by slowing down the process of surveillance acquisition, you could in some ways say that it's like putting a wrench in the gears of surveillance capitalism by trying to make this process of accumulation much more frictionful, so that people have the opportunity to build the relationships, to build an understanding, to build political agency. So then the question became, as we were working in this coalition, how could we as HCI researchers, and by here I mean the we, that it was like me, students that I was working with that were from across communication, computer science, and other departments at UCSD, as well as tech workers who were coming in from Tech Worker Coalition, like how could we as these computing people strengthen the coalition's work? And so I'll just give a couple of examples. One example is providing counter expertise. So when as the streetlights kind of got into the news after these community meetings, as community organizers started raising questions, the city was making statements that you can see on the upper left here in this NBC San Diego quote. The data collected from these nodes, the streetlights, is exclusively owned by the city, and any assertion otherwise is wholly inaccurate. Now, we had Cedric Whitney Cedric Robinson's great, but Cedric Whitney, who's now a PhD student at Berkeley, was at San Diego, and his previous job had been looking at contracts for AI health startups, and he had an engineering degree. So he went and did a public records request at the city, got the contract, the city signed with GE, and in fact, read that the city had signed over rights to GE of basically a copy of all the data on the streetlights. GE had owned all the processed data that they would use for their, their algorithms touched in doing their kind of AI object detection. And then we went and found networks of actual lawyers who affirmed that this reading of the contract is real. And I think I think that this is a place where the institutional legitimacy of a university, even if in a context of settler colonialism, a university can be an institution that denies the validity of indigenous knowledge, and we have to dismantle that history. As a tactic, having a UCSD research team say that this is actually a reading of the contract that shows that the city thinks that it owns the data, but it doesn't, was a way we could kind of provide both the time to do this kind of finding the information and interpreting, and then also the kind of publicly legitimating statement to counter the city's own claims. Another way that we supported the work of the coalition was by being available to go to community forums. So the coalition was not just a bunch of people who had an analysis and opinion. They were also a group of people who are going out and publicly educating others in San Diego, going from neighborhood to neighborhood. We went to mosques, we went to all kinds of council districts, and made sure people had the opportunity to learn about the streetlights. Because in order to build political agency, you have to threaten something that the decision maker in power wants. And so if we have city council members who want to get reelected, then we have to build up the people power to actually make a threat to the reelection prospects. And so we educate because, I'm an educator. I obviously care about the value of education, but we also educate to build political agency. And we also have these community forums as sites of dialogue where people would say things like, wait, aren't these streetlights going to create good jobs? I want jobs. And we could speak about, well, okay, who are the people that really are going to get jobs from these streetlights? And, are that going to go to the people, do you get the educational resources in your neighborhood to get the kinds of jobs that you're hoping for? Let's talk about that. So these community forums are essential. They're not the kind of thing that goes on our CVs. They don't generate patents. They don't get us jobs in the tech industry. But I think we have to recognize that a lot of how tech education is organized probably is optimized around building economic value for companies. And community forums are a way of working against that, in some sense providing free, actually public education. And this in some ways, this next tactic in some ways echoes the counter expertise tactic. But early on, I published an op-ed kind of analyzing the surveillance streetlights as this kind of innovation project. And I made an argument in the op-ed section of a publication that's widely read by city council members and staff and technocrats, saying that San Diegans should not be lab rats for innovation. And so I took a lot of what people all over critical innovation studies have been saying and publishing in STS, and I just spent, actually what happened is I spent 2 minutes writing it up as a speech to give it a rally. And then I just wrote an extended version in a day that it's to submit to the newspaper. And this also became something that people who are working within the city who are uncomfortable with this project, they could point to, even if the people in the mayor's office were kind of trying to put a lid on it. Another tactic was that the design lab crew that had come together to help the coalition, we found ourselves constantly telling journalists, telling community members stories about what the infrastructure could potentially be used for, as a way of kind of translating it into terms that they would care about, and they would start to try to get involved. And things like, hey, small business owner, do you want GE to sell data about the footfall in front of your coffee shop to Starbucks, so then Starbucks can come move in next to you? Do you want to know if that's happening? That's an example of it kind of speculatively translating this infrastructure into terms that someone might care about. So we ended up holding what we called a slightly dystopian hackathon to build demos of a bunch of these scenarios to undercut some of the infrastructure champions narratives. So if the infrastructure champions narrative was of these streetlights, even though they're primarily used by the police, and even though we never talked about it, the argument became these are good for public safety. And so we ended up, one of the demos we ended up building was called Someone Walks Home Alone at Night, which used the streetlight live data to identify places where somebody was walking by themselves. So we could say, hey, look, like this API provides real-time data to anyone without any vetting, and they could build creepy stuff like this stalker app that we've built. Now, the thing that was interesting about the demo is that we as a team learned a lot and engaged in the kind of critical reflective practice that Matt Ratto talks about. But the thing that became important about the outcome of this demo building event was that we actually discovered the streetlights don't produce real-time pedestrian data. Like they're actually quite broken. So the city paid $30 million, and turns out like all the planning sustainability data it was supposed to provide didn't even work. And so that one of the directors of a nonprofit said, hey, could you write a report on that? And I asked, like, how long do we have to write that report? And he said, could you get a draft to the city council president in 24 hours? And so Cedric and I stayed up very late, and we wrote a report called Civic Innovation with City IQ, and that's the one that's over on the left, Technological, Organizational, Fiscal, and Equity Challenges in San Diego. This ended up being one of 2 bespoke policy reports we wrote, and I call it a bespoke policy report because they were kind of written on demand based on the kinds of political exigencies of what city council members were asking about this system, and what framing of the information we thought would make the coalition's kind of research most accessible to them. And so when I talk about fiscal challenges, we were appealing to more Republican budget-minded city council members. And when we talk about equity challenges in the title, we're talking to more social justice-oriented city council members. And the thing that I was really surprised by is that, these reports were often, like the product of research that had been happening for over a year, but we didn't quite know who needed the report and in what form. Until some like council meeting happened and someone said something that we thought was not true, and so then we quickly put the report together. So these reports became important ways that we could use our institutional legitimacy and our research skills to support the coalition in official spheres like city council. And so about a year and a half in, our coalition is winning in the sense that we had a vote on our ordinance last November, and through also tons of work through our city council champion Monica Montgomery, that ordinance got 9 votes from everybody on the city council. It was voted unanimously, and now we're in the process of having the city unions look at it, and there's going to have to be a second vote. In addition to some of what I talked about as HCI specific things that we helped with in the coalition, the key strategies were really, community organizers who mobilized hundreds of city council calls in an election year to really put pressure on the electeds who were otherwise, were uncomfortable with the system, but were also really scared to take it on because it was a really complex problem. So we made it so that it would cost them something not to take it on. We also framed this surveillance oversight ordinance as something that aligned with both progressive and conservative council member values like privacy, fiscal prudence, as well as racial and immigration justice. And then we kept the focus on this oversight process rather than on specific technologies. Because if we'd gone in there and said the streetlights are bad, I mean, one, this tech's coming up like whack-a-mole, but two, I think this happens with facial recognition also. Talking about a specific technology moves the terrain of who can have an opinion about it to technical experts. Is face rec good? Is face rec bad? What are its technical capacities? By keeping the focus on this democratic oversight process and deferring those kinds of specific technical debates, it made it something that lots of community members could get involved in, understand, and have a legitimate stake in pushing to their city council officials. So the next case, I've shared with you one case study where our HCI team fit in with the work of a highly organized coalition of people who knew how to get out into the community and get people involved in an issue and to influence electeds. The next case is a case where that kind of organizing capacity is not so clear, like has historically not so clearly been there. I want to talk about a decade-long project in which software and research that I and my collaborators did helped workers gain some power, but also over a decade, this system became a band-aid for a flawed system. And so with this case study, I want to argue that for a future of work with good conditions for AI data processing workers, we need to invest the most basic resources in workers so that they can take the time to create their own spaces, learn how to organize and build power together, and to identify and set the agendas for the changes that are going to make that they feel will actually improve their day-to-day lives and the platforms that they work on. Just to give you a teaser, I'm an HCI person. I've learned to do tech research and design, but I'm going to end with, well, actually, I think the most powerful thing a lot of us can do right now is just to donate money to workers to get them that time. So just to give the context that I'm talking about, Amazon Mechanical Turk is a platform that Amazon operates as part of its Amazon Web Services, and it allows people who need lots of data labeling done for machine learning, or lots of transcription done, or lots of content moderation done. It allows them to put large piles of data processing work out onto the Amazon Mechanical Turk platform, set a price per task, and then access workers who are in their homes on the platform, ready to kind of grab these jobs. And so in some sense, you could think of it as a kind of like Uber for data processing. Like in Uber, workers are treated as independent contractors and are defined as independent contractors in Amazon's terms and conditions. So there's no minimum wage on the form. But also the workers that I've talked to, like they appreciate the things that they appreciate are that if they want to go out and take care of their kid, like they can show up to grab some tasks, then they can go take some time off to go do something else. They appreciate that they can work from home. They appreciate that even though they might have an algorithmic boss, they don't have a person literally watching their every move like they might have in some workplaces. And so there are things that workers really value about this platform, the workers that I have met. The way the platform works is like, so a worker might show up on the Amazon Mechanical Turk website, and they have 1,200 employers they could potentially choose from. And so Sik Silberman and I, back in 2009, 12 years ago now, we built a system called Turkopticon that is kind of like Yelp for employers. We just insert, we have a database of reviews that workers write about employers. And then when the worker is on the platform looking at which employer they should pick from, we insert a button by which they can quickly access the reviews other workers have written, kind of grafted in. So what these reviews would allow workers to do is like hear from, if a worker had worked for a requester and that an employer is called a requester on the platform, the worker had worked with a requester and that requester had, say, run off with all the data processing work a worker had done and not paid for it, that worker could report that and other workers could avoid that person. And this is actually a big problem on the platform. Amazon gives full authority to the employer to decide whether or not they're going to pay for the work. Ostensibly is to allow employers the freedom to kind of reject work that is of poor quality, that doesn't have correct answers or is literally spam. But there's no checks to make sure that the employer actually is rejecting truly bad faith work. And so employers can use it to essentially blame workers for tasks that they designed poorly, or they could use it to just get free work and not pay for it. And what happens to workers when that happens is that the worker has what is called their approval rating, the percentage of tasks that they do. Their approval rating, the percentage of tasks that they've had approved goes down, and that can actually reduce their access to work on the platform, because employers can say, only show my job to workers who have this approval rating. So this platform, has existed for 12 years, and there's like labor economists who did a study, and he even established that workers who use Turkopticon compared to those who don't make a few pennies an hour more on average by being able to browse information. But not all statistically significant impacts are significant in terms of your life. And one of the problems with Turkopticon is that in order for someone to write the review saying, hey, you all should avoid this employer, some workers still had to get hurt. Turkopticon offers a way of navigating around harms, but it doesn't eliminate the upstream sources of harm that are part of, are a product of platform policies and employer practices. So after about 10 years, Turkopticon had become something that could allay some worker anxieties, make them feel like they might avoid the worst of the worst. But it also, we had also found out that Amazon actually told workers who would raise issues to them as a company about the platform. Amazon would actually tell them to go to forums like Turkopticon and just talk to workers there and kind of deal with it themselves. So, after 10 years of running this platform and then finding out that Amazon was essentially outsourcing the kind of work of remedying harms to the community to deal with it themselves, and to coders who are maintaining these systems, and to other worker forums beyond Turkopticon, like that are an important part of the Turker ecology. To be quite honest, I was experiencing, and I think I was experiencing quite a bit of burnout. And burnout is that feeling that like you're working really hard, but nothing is really changing, and like you can't keep going like this forever. I hadn't made this project so it could be a band-aid for a broken and exploitative corner of the academic, industrial, and innovation industrial complex. So we made a shift. We made a shift. We put out a call and said, hey, we want to turn over Turkopticon to Turk workers, and we want Turk workers to make decisions about how the platform should run, what is the work that it should do, and how it can best help you make Turk work better. And our initial calls were kind of on a discussion forum, and Turkers looked at it, they talked about it, they maybe got into debates about it, but nobody showed up as an organized group. And so we discovered, okay, like you can't just like open up the doors and hope that people come in. So then we got a grant from the Open Society Foundation, which would allow us to pay Turk workers for their time to participate in workshops and to spend the time learning about the platform, learning about policy, and coming together to make decisions. And so we held 2 workshops, and we put out a call and said, hey, do you want to shape the future of Turkopticon? You're a Turker, please come to these workshops. And those workshops became places where, out of the 40 people who came to those workshops, 3 stuck around and said, hey, we want to figure out what the future of Turkopticon should be, for different reasons. Like, they relied on the platform and they wanted it to be a better job than it was, but they didn't want the platform to go away, or they felt it was really important to have a source of reviews of employers that was always available for free rather than monetized for new workers. And that team of 3 workers has now become a team of 12 workers, and they're actually organizing their first campaign. And the campaign is about tackling this problem that I talked about of rejections on the platform, these unilateral rejections. So the grant was really important to allow for the creation of the time and the space for workers to come together to really have to accomplish a lot to get to this point. Together, I and the workers had to learn to organize, plan a transition, and how to build a team that could focus on a shared mission and work together really well. And over the last year, this has been a transition away from being a software project run by a designer, an engineer, and a few worker moderators. It has been a transition to an organizing project run by a growing team of Turk workers, with seed funding to support the time, the trainings, the conversations needed to have all of us learn the organizing skills neither Turking nor engineering gave us. So Over the last year, we have a lead organizer, longtime Turk worker Sherry Stanley, who has stepped up and been brave and willing to speak and write publicly about the issues that she hears about in her one-on-ones and discussions with many other Turk workers. Worker organizers have to spend time canvassing Turker forums and doing one-on-one conversations to understand what the broad needs and concerns are. And they facilitate workshops to develop creative proposals for these longstanding problems like mass rejections. Now, Turkopticon is also has contributors that are Tech Worker Coalition programmers who operate and make improvements to software features and stability. And the worker organizers have also a network of mentors who are labor organizers or legal, like lawyers and legal experts who can help them strategize. So I can say after about a year and a half, that Six and I can truly get hit by a bus, and Turkopticon will not only survive, but actually be much better than what it was for the last 10 years, and maybe have a hope of addressing some of the problems the software couldn't, the problems that would require changes to the actual platform architecture and policies, or changes to requester practices. Moving forward, we've given up hope that software and information sharing will spontaneously generate a coordinated strategy for change. Those were dreams that many had for Facebook, blogs, and Twitter, that many individuals sharing online could enable the envisioning and pursuit of political change. We've all seen that this dream can crash hard in the chaos of the last couple of years of polarization. Organizing work is not just about communication or even engaging people. It's also about shaping a conversation among many to create focus, to generate knowledge resources, to do the emotional work of creating the conditions of consensus, and building trust relationships so that people believe that by engaging in this more collective effort, that something good can come of it, and that the people who are helping organize this effort are not gonna, to be frank, screw each other over. I'm convinced that this is what is essential for a future of work that works for workers that power AI, not just new tools, new ways of building resumes, or new software platforms like the ones that we built. So if you're out there and you're a computing researcher and you're interested in building a better future of work for the people that your machine learning relies on, I encourage you to please, at this point, just please donate directly to worker organizers. We live in a society where people in universities have the privilege of having spaces to create and imagine, and we need to redistribute that funding to make the time for people who are more directly affected to have spaces to create, learn, build knowledge, and imagine under terms that they control, to set agendas that truly meet their everyday needs. And so I put a URL in there, and I can put it in the chat later as well during Q&A. So I'm going to conclude by talking about how this claiming a political agency requires us to learn new ways of organizing and relating. This talk today is my attempt to respond to what I've learned about how the innovation economy organizes us. So I've studied tech entrepreneurs and middle-class people trying to make social enterprise as a way of making positive social change. And what I found is that the innovation economy wants us as kind of tech workers to privilege the design vision over shared control. It asks us to channel our senses of injustice into entrepreneurial design initiatives that might build innovative technologies that can become sites of financial investment, but don't challenge the overarching agenda or structures that produce the issues that we work on. The innovation economy asks us to organize our sense of community into contained projects rather than being connected to power movements and social movements. And it divides us into designers and users, the imaginers, and the people who are supposed to kind of use and maybe reappropriate, but not change the fundamental structures of the technology. And I'm pushing us to find ways to work together that actually expand the conditions of collective governance over technology. So if the innovation economy needs experts and legitimacy and what some have called ethics washing, then this kind of ethics from below I'm talking about requires us to build political capacities of all affected communities. I know we're running out of time, so I will just, I'll wrap this up in like 2 slides. The political stakes of infrastructure are that they standardize our practices and our ways of relating to each other. They get reused over and over again in different domains. They connect the fates of different communities whose lives are being shaped by the infrastructures and the practices that are built on those infrastructures. And as many have shown, like they exclude those who do not fit the assumptions of the infrastructure, dividing us from each other. So who should direct this political agency over infrastructure? I would argue that it's not the people who are ethics experts or those of us who are design or design experts, but with Sasha Costanza-Chalk, with Virginia Eubanks, with Ruha Benjamin and others, I would argue that it should be the will of those most directly impacted or harmed. But what I hope I've shown is that getting groups who are not usually brought into the technology conversation to be able to articulate what they want out of technology and have a seat at the table requires different kinds of collaborations than the ones that we've historically had. And it also requires us to be, both ask ourselves and help others who are affected by these technologies to build the kind of power that we can exercise in political institutions. But what about participation in design? So Niloufar Salehi made this meme when I was talking to her about some of the ideas in this talk. And this is when the Suez boat was trapped in the canal. And so there's a harm and injustice from technology are like this huge juggernaut that happens across many infrastructures by the acts of many different levels of like the political system, from the city council to the federal government to how companies act. And participation in the ways that we talk about it, just bringing people into our design processes and helping us together imagine something different, feels sometimes like you're pushing the gigantic boat. Instead, what can seem overwhelming can be tackled by building small campaigns and projects that build power around real issues that people feel. And here I'm drawing on George Lakey, who's a community organizing educator. Rather than getting overwhelmed by the scale of how big the platform or how big surveillance is, think about like, what's like one thing that you can work with others to tackle? And if a bunch of people are working on that one thing, and building campaigns and campaigns and campaigns, building trust relationships, learning to organize together, like coming to better understandings of how these technologies work and how institutions make decisions, then those campaigns and campaigns and campaigns coming together equal, in Lakey's chalkboard diagram here, a movement. And then if you have movements like around surveillance, around immigration justice, around climate change, that can come, can then have the capacity that they've built through their concrete organizing come together, then you can have a movement of movements. And he argues that this movement of movements is what we need to address climate change and the challenges of being accountable to and dismantling the legacies of settler colonialism that our conveners opened up this talk with. So please don't be overwhelmed. And I hope that we can all develop these plural ways of working that can come together into something bigger. Thank you for being here and thank you for convening us. And I'm sorry I went long.
Lilly, thank you so much. No apologies necessary. This was amazing. We do have some time now for questions, so please stay with us. You can send your questions via the Q&A box. Anita Chen and I will moderate, and I will read aloud our first question from the audience. So Lilly, the first question is from Jennifer Grabmeyer. Did your lab engage workers in concepting and creating Turkopticon in the first place?
Sort of, in a distributed way, yeah. So the first step, we write about this in a paper called Turkopticon, Interrupting Workers' Visibility in Amazon Mechanical Turk, if you want to get the details. But I first put a survey onto Mechanical Turk asking, like, what do you like about this job? What do you not like about this job? As a way of kind of getting to know workers through this weird distributed platform. And of course, I paid workers for their time responding. And then just based on what I learned there, I then created a task. If you could have a Turker's Bill of Rights, what would you want to have in it? And I got I think I got 67 of those answers, and I just went and coded them. And workers talked about all kinds of things, and there were a lot of points that they disagreed on, like, should there be a minimum wage or not? But one point that most workers actually independently named was this rejection problem. And so we built Turkopticon around that rejection problem. Now, 10 years later, I guess that's what social movement organizers call points of unity in a diverse community. But I was a computer science person. I didn't know any of those things, but I just kind of and then I put together some wireframes, and then I put out another survey saying, hey, if like a system like this existed, would you have a problem? Are there any problems you can see with it? And would you be interested in using it? And I got pretty affirmative answers. I posted to some worker forums. So I never had like a workshop kind of thing, but I kind of went to workers where they were, which is the Mechanical Turk platform and worker forums, and solicited feedback there. And then when we built it, a lot of workers did use it for quite, like I think at our peak, we had like 20,000 workers using it. But it was kind of weird because I felt like I'd been trained to do all this in-depth contextual inquiry. I worked as a designer before I went to do my PhD. And this really felt like, oh, sometimes the need's like pretty acute. And as long as we kind of substituted accountability for like lead up participation. Like we built a prototype in a couple of days, and then we like changed it based on what people were telling us, rather than like doing some really extended like ethnography. And I don't think the workers would have let us follow them around anyways, now in hindsight.
The next question is from Chelsea Birchmeyer. She says, as a union member, I'm wondering what you think the role of labor unions and unionization is in building political agency over digital infrastructures. What do you think about the possibilities of unionization under the conditions of a job like Amazon Mechanical Turk? And relatedly, she also says, I've also seen organized labor support surveillance efforts uncritically at times with the argument that they might be able to create more jobs. Any thoughts on how to counter this argument and how to build power with organized labor and efforts for democratic oversight?
That's a really good question. I'm really glad you're thinking about those things. So on the Amazon Mechanical Turk and unionization, the fact is that what I hear from Sherry and other Turk worker organizers who are, talking to those communities every day is that unionization is a word that makes people in that community run the other way. And it could be for a variety of reasons, but it's not part of the points of unity right now. Also, because I would say personally, because Turk workers are independent contractors, but they're not quite like Uber. Even though I used Uber as an analogy, like in the Uber case in California, we had this huge debate around Prop 22. And there's like very clear that the only consumer of the driver's labor is Uber, who then sells it to customers and sets the rates. But with Amazon Mechanical Turk, you've got lots and lots of employers. So if workers did, if there are some workers who did want to pursue employment classification, like they would have to figure out a different strategy than what's being followed with Prop 22. Like, and there are possible strategies, but I don't speak for workers, and there might be some workers watching right now, and I think that I'm not going to try to represent the complexity of the debates that they have about unionization, but just sharing that it's not it's not my personal opinion, and it's also not super obvious that unionization is kind of like gonna be the answer. I think sometimes, to be honest, like I feel like sometimes when people say unionization, it comes out as like an easy answer, like, hey, what's the thing that's not being atomized? It's joining a union. But having an active union is something that takes, it takes a lot of work from everybody, as it should. And I'm a big fan of Jane McAlevey, whose book No Shortcuts is about how to build unions that really involve workers from the bottom up in like all stages of like power building and negotiating the terms of the contract. She critiques some of the way some unions have turned into like low membership organizations that use their dues to like lobby politicians for policies, like without much accountability to workers. So I'm a big believer in that, like that model that really like involves the actual people who would be affected in making decisions. And on the sort of uncritical adoption of surveillance tech by unions, that one reference that you might already know is James Boggs' The American Revolution. It's an essay that, sorry, the virtual background. Okay, well, it's an essay he wrote, this Chrysler auto worker and Marxist theorist, James Boggs, wrote in the 60s. And he talks about how the unions were uncritically being pro-automation because they thought, well, we're going to shed a bunch of workers and add to the ranks of the unemployed, but the workers that stay are going to get these higher paying jobs, like manipulating these more advanced technologies. I think we're just repeating stuff that's been going for a long time. And in this book, he sort of argues that, if there's going to be a technology adopted that then creates unemployment or creates harm, like workers need to fight to also get those harms addressed, like, basic income, for example. I think in like his case is one of the things he suggests. So Boggs kind of makes a distinction between workers, the unions, and the companies. And like we have to analyze unions as their own organizations that are seeking to reproduce themselves. And they have different ways of trying to do that. And I'm more for a Jane McAlevey style of it than some of the other styles of it. I will say it's interesting though, because Andy Stern, who's the president of the SEIU, who Jane McAlevey critiques as being this kind of like donating to campaigns rather than power building from below, he cites Turkopticon as this like new tech thing that can like be labor 2.0. And I would like to put I would put a stop to that right here and say like, no, like we ran this thing for 10 years and it makes a teeny tiny difference, but like the real differences are going to come from changes to platform policies and laws.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. The next question is from Frankie Spector. It often seems that the structure of academia doesn't reward this incredible, amazing work, or even publishing beyond it, such as in more widely read public op-eds. Do you have suggestions for academic workers, speaking especially as a grad student, for how we can structure our own labor to make the largest impact beyond just pointing a finger at the problem?
It's a really great observation. Yeah, to be completely honest, I feel like, going through the process of getting tenure, it made it really hard to do any of these things that I'm talking about today. And I found it quite frustrating because I felt like in some ways the process of getting tenure made me like a bad neighbor, like a bad like member of the community, because I had to focus on kind of just publications. One way I dealt with it was I actually tried to make Turkopticon not something that I was getting my tenure on, which is like why I had the book, because this sounds like the opposite of what you're asking, because this is not a time saver. This is like this is going to take more time, but like I didn't want to force Turkopticon and my relationships to workers to have to look a certain way or to produce certain kinds of legible projects. So I have a few papers on Turkopticon that are like, here are things that happen that I think are a contribution to the debates that we're having, but I don't do the like I'm constructing a project so that I can then do an evaluation of it later kind of research. And in some ways, anthropology was like helpful for that, because I'm trained in anthropology to do participant observation, and so my own participation is something that I can take field notes on and analyze rigorously and write about and interpret. But I think that I also maybe there's hope, because I made a lot of mistakes. And I think one of the mistakes that I made that you don't have to make is treating our projects, the projects that are part of like building political capacity, like we don't have to treat them as things that we do alone as individual projects. Like academia disciplines us to say like, okay, what's your dissertation gonna be? You gotta show that that's your contribution. And, and that's fine. Like I have my student Ulayan, like we're working with taxi workers, and then we have a sense of like, okay, if like the project's really like going slower than the Kai deadline, like here's a little thing that we can write about. Like we kind of develop these like parallel track plans, but also, if you want to do a project of the kinds of things that I've been showing you, like maybe you can get lots of people involved, and so people can share the work and support each other. And like if you need to check out to go like do your academic checkbox thing, then you can, that you're not going to be like leaving the project and the community groups that you're part of in a lurch to do that. So I think I wish I had someone to tell me like reach out and like build a group, build a team. And then I would, yeah, like, I guess that would be, I hope that's not too confusing. Like, I guess, yeah, like my advice would be like, carve out the thing that you know you can do to like graduate, and then try to create as much space and support and like collective energy for the things that you think are really important beyond that. And maybe you can, if you're lucky, you can construct the thing you have to do to graduate so that it also has this like surplus of like helping you analyze something that's important for that other effort, but making them loosely coupled rather than a dependency between the two is probably good.
That's really great. The next question is from, gets us back to the topic of surveillance and smart city infrastructures and organizing therein. And it's from a student from Carious Research Group, Silas Su, who asks, how do you imagine finding communities that are affected by smart city infrastructures once you know what these infrastructures can support?
Oh yeah, like what should I have done? What should I have done in like 2018? No one's asked me that before. That's a good question. Yeah, I guess it probably, I mean, it depends where you live, but I guess what I could have done is I could have sent an email to like, yeah, like I could have done a news search to see who's doing racial justice work or immigrant justice work. I actually knew about Pillars of the Community before because I had read this Cal Gangs database story and it had completely blown my mind. Like it was, which says a lot about my privilege. So yeah, like maybe like doing a news search, like seeing who's like actually been doing organizing around the kinds of like who, not only like who cares about the thing that you care about, but maybe who's like actually acting on some of the things that you're worried about. And then maybe trying to send them an email and see if, you know, like, hey, like I'm seeing this thing, you know, do you know about it? Like, can we meet up and just have a coffee and talk about it? It could be as simple as that. I think working with organizations that are a little bit more local can be easier because sometimes really big organizations that have like nationwide fundraising campaigns that you can just, I won't name any names, like they have agendas that are set kind of on an annual basis that are part of their strategy, and like they have all their like mobilization and lobbying and stuff built around like a particular schedule of things they're going to deal with. But I think with local groups, whether they're nonprofits or just like organized groups like neighborhoods, whatever, you know, they can respond to stuff that's not, you know, they can respond to stuff that you bring up potentially, have more flexibility.
And I'm going to follow up with a part 2 to that question. It's amazing that you managed to introduce policies that require discussion by Privacy Advisory Board and at a city council. What can or might have happened in times of emergency, such as a pandemic, when the narrative prioritizes safety, people want to remove friction?
Yeah, that's like the problem of like declaring a crisis as a way of creating some authoritative kind of action. That's a really good question. I mean, some of what I've been seeing happening around me in San Diego is people pointing to the ways that, pointing to where work is needed to create real safety. So there's a mutual aid group called We All We Got that got built in San Diego in response to the pandemic. And so while, you know, like while the mayor was like creating like a homeless shelter in the convention center, and, you know, budgets are being cut for like libraries, and BLM was calling for defunding the police and like not getting as far as they, you know, as we wanted to here. I think people were trying to create like more autonomous like provisions of care and safety, and then sometimes those can become powerful. They become not only ways of doing, they don't become only alternative infrastructures, they also become like a testament, like a public demonstration of like where the supposed authority that, you know, people like those with power marshal in a crisis, like it becomes like a counter argument in public to the argument that they're making. Yeah, we're lucky that we got the ordinance kind of in before, you know, before COVID happened. But to be honest, like also with COVID, I mean, one of the things that's happened a lot in San Diego, I mean, COVID has kind of been this like long crisis too. And there's been budget cuts. And like one of the things that we kept hammering with the surveillance ordinance was like, hey, big tech is actually wasting your money. Like you spent $30 million on this thing and like it doesn't even do the thing that you said it was gonna, you know, that you said you wanted it to do. And so in that way, maybe be open and flexible about which arguments are gonna get you the allies that you need, you know, even if it's not the whole argument, because that's like what politics is. And so, you know, so we actually, when council was reconsidering the budgets because of COVID shortfalls, we lost a bunch of tourism revenue. San Diego is very dependent on taxation from tourism. Like there's like a big community alliance that was coming together to ask for like rental assistance, eviction moratoriums, and you know, also to fight the shutdown of the library. Like one of the mayor had proposed to shut down a library in a neighborhood that's like already underserved. And in the city council meeting, the people who were calling in for the budget, you know, they started hearing that we were also calling in to say, hey, like you need to cut the budget, stop paying the streetlights bill. And then they started picking up our streetlights bill thing. And then like we built a formal alliance with that community budget alliance, and they started publicizing that the streetlights are a waste of money and should be cut. So yeah, like I think the crisis can play in different ways.
The next question is from Shay Malloy, who says, it seems like the police were the ones who predominantly use their surveillance systems for IoT programs. Do you think these surveillance systems, framing themselves to make a city smarter by using tech for good, would be less harmful or at least more helpful if they were also used as tools by communities? Is there a way for communities to use the tools?
Yeah, that's something that we talked about a lot. Like, I mean, on one level, you could ask like, you know, okay, if the streetlights were really made for communities to use the tools, how would they be different? Like the way they are right now, there's a very limited API of data that the streetlights produce, those like pedestrian, like auto counts. You know, like what kind of data would communities want to get out of it? What objects would they want to recognize out of it? Would communities actually say like, you know, the libraries should actually manage the surveillance streetlights? Sorry, I'm supposed to call them smart streetlights for the imaginary world. This question is casting. You know, like maybe the library can manage the smart streetlights and like police can't access it without a warrant. You know, they have to like do their homework to like get authorization to access that data. But then you could say like, okay, well, who has the knowledge that can actually use that data? Like in a United States where like Jane Margulis's book, Stuck in the Shallow End, is about the ways that computer science education is only available to students in rich schools. And there it's like as an elective. And as we actually tried to train Turk workers to code so that we could modify the Turkopticon platform. And I kind of like, I had to confront the fact that like, those of us who know how to code have like had like 4 years of like tuition money and like time to not be working another job to like learn how to manipulate this stuff, right? So, you know, do those libraries for those communities like also need to have a coder in residence so communities can have someone help them build the stuff that they would actually want? We can imagine all that, and I love imagining all that. But I would also say then there's like, once you lay down an infrastructure, it can be used for things that you didn't expect. Once you lay down the train tracks for one purpose, it can be used for something else. And so we would have to ask like, are these surveillance cameras with their microphones, are they useful enough to justify the thing that they can more easily be used for? Which is like live stream surveillance, you know, in sort of the extreme case. And, you know, I think a lot of people in San Diego in these community coalitions would say, no, it doesn't provide enough value. And like the threat of kind of like the constant surveillance by an entity you can't even see or respond to or question, like that, you know, that risk is just too likely. I know Seda Gorses has been working on this issue of vaccine passports, and one of her concerns has been that like when do you lay down the vaccine passport infrastructure, it's like transnational infrastructure of authentication, like what else is it going to be used for? Like it can be used to track people across great many countries. It can be used to monetize and sell their information. It can, you know, and so all the problems that people talk about when they talk about surveillance capitalism or criminalization through surveillance is like you're extending the train tracks for that. and you have to contend with like the latent and possible futures. So I think that's one of the things that makes this infrastructures thing really an important frame, because infrastructure can be used so many different ways once it's laid down. And like, how do we grapple with that?
So Lily, there's so many more amazing questions about blockchain, about what courses people should take, but we want to give you a break. And thank you for an amazing talk. And we also want to take a moment to thank our production team and invite them to revideo. None of this would be possible without the back-end work of Mitchell Oliver, Jin Yigu, Vinay Koshi, Gabe Mallow, Adrian Wong, Cheyenne Putz, Katie Peterson, and our awesome ASL translators, Laura and Nick from UIUC's DRES office. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today. A recording of this talk, as well as the links shared in our chat today, will be posted to our website. We will also be sharing the questions that were not answered with Lily. Please join us again for our last event for the spring calendar with Sasha Constanza-Chak, who will be speaking on design justice next week, Wednesday, May 5th, same time. We hope to see you there. And final note, we will be back in the fall. So keep your eyes open. Thank you all, and thank you, Lily.
Thank you so much. I can stick around a tiny bit and try to like answer some of those questions in the Q&A too. Maybe just like 3 minutes I'll spend there, but I really appreciate the chance to present this work and look forward to conversations on the internet in whatever mediums are possible.
Awesome. The question, there's a great question from Christian Pascual. In the blockchain decentralized technology space, a common way to give power to the community is issuing governance tokens that are distributed proportionally to the contribution actors made to the community. What challenges do you see to implement a model like this to give power to the community over infrastructures?
Well, I think the contributions to the community thing raises a flag for me about who has the time and resources to contribute to the community. It's kind of like, it can take the form of like, you know, like in open source communities where you have like, you know, people who, you know, don't have to take care of elders or, you know, don't have a job, you know, aren't working 2 jobs and like know how to code, are the ones who are going to make a lot of contributions to the code base. But just because someone doesn't have time to make contributions doesn't mean that they shouldn't have a say because they're impacted. And I think that's, so I think like that, what democracy means to me is like, we recognize like society needs all kinds of things that people do for it to function. And that includes coding, childcare, raising plants and feeding people, you know, picking up stuff up, you know, picking up trash on the streets, like elder care. And we assume that people are making some kind of contribution, but they should have a say over the things that are shared, whether or not they made a contribution to that specific substrate. Like, I don't see why you would focus on, you know, those who contribute to blockchain should have, you know, governance over blockchain. If like blockchain is going to like mediate a bunch of our financial transactions, you know, and the way businesses work. But I'm not actually a blockchain expert, so you could come back and say like, you're missing this really important thing, and that's entirely possible.
Thank you for that extra time. And thank you for answering the question in the chat in real time while speaking. And so goodbye again.
Okay, and, goodbye. I'll see you all in a little bit.
We'll see you
thank
all
you,
in your next session. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.